Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe and tap the bell icon. The door slammed open with such force that the clinking of silverware stopped mid-ring. All eyes turned to the entrance, and a heavy silence fell over the room, thick as fog. A man stood there, framed by the dim, late afternoon light streaming through the windows. His presence was like a sudden storm, unsettling, commanding, impossible to ignore. In his arms, a small, trembling dog with a service vest looked out at the room, its eyes wide, scanning the unfamiliar faces. The dog was alert, yet clearly anxious. The man, though, was calm. His demeanor was not one of arrogance but of something else, something that made the air shift, making the hairs on the back of people's necks stand up. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and wore a military jacket that hung loosely on his frame. A thick, leather strap, his dog's leash, was wrapped around his hand, and he held it tightly. The room fell still. From the corner of the room, a sharp voice broke the silence. "Hey!" The tone was abrupt, the words almost like a command. "That dog isn't allowed here." The man didn't flinch. He took a step inside, and his boots made a sharp sound against the tiled floor, cutting through the tense quiet. His eyes, a piercing blue, scanned the room with a cold, calculating gaze. Every head turned toward him. The dog's paws scraped gently against the floor as it trotted behind him, its eyes flickering with unease but trusting the man beside it. "You're going to have to leave," the voice repeated, louder now, tinged with impatience. It came from the young woman behind the counter. She was clearly trying to regain control of the situation, but her voice trembled slightly, betraying her nerves. The air seemed to thicken around her, and the other staff members exchanged quick, uncertain glances. Without a word, the man walked forward, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. His boots clicked rhythmically with each step, echoing in the hollow stillness of the restaurant. He reached the counter slowly, deliberately. The dog stood by his side, now fully focused on the woman, its ears perked, its gaze unblinking. "Sir," the woman said, clearly trying to remain composed, "I'm sorry, but you can't bring that dog in here. It's against the restaurant's policy." The man's jaw tightened as he placed his hand firmly on the counter. There was no anger in his face, no rash movement, just a quiet authority that spoke louder than any raised voice could. He didn't seem like someone who would back down easily. "I didn't come here to argue," he said, his voice steady but firm, with a low, almost magnetic quality. "I came to eat. And I'm not leaving without my dog." His words hung in the air, heavy and thick. The woman blinked, unsure how to respond. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, and the sternness in the man's voice unsettled her. There was something about him that was unyielding, like a force of nature she couldn't control. She glanced at the dog, then back at him. "You have to leave," she repeated, but this time her voice faltered slightly. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. The restaurant had always been strict about their no-pet policy. But this wasn't a regular pet, it was a service dog, and the rules surrounding service animals were complicated. She wasn't sure if she even knew them all. Her hand hovered near the phone, ready to call a manager, but before she could dial, the man stepped closer to the counter. The movement was deliberate, and in that instant, the tension in the room ratcheted up another level. Everyone, from the seated customers to the waitstaff in the back, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint click of the dog's claws against the floor. The man leaned in slightly, his face now only inches from the woman's. His eyes, locked on hers, were cold, assessing. "I'm not asking for permission," he said quietly, almost a whisper, but the authority in his tone made the words feel like a thunderclap. The young woman stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't sure what to do now. This wasn't just any customer, this was someone who carried himself like he had been through things most people couldn't imagine. A man who didn't have to ask for permission. A man who was used to having his way. I understand, she said, her voice barely audible. But you still need to leave unless you can show me proper documentation for your dog. I have to follow the rules. She was stalling. It was obvious. The rules didn't always make sense, but she had no choice. This was her job. She had to enforce them. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was dealing with someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. The man didn't say a word. He simply took a step back, turned slightly, and glanced toward the other end of the room. His eyes narrowed, his focus sharpening. The dog shifted beside him, clearly sensing the shift in energy. That was when it happened. The door to the restaurant swung open again. The heavy thud of boots against the floor filled the room, breaking the silence. The door closed with a soft click behind them. Four Marines, all in full dress uniform, stepped inside. The young woman's heart skipped a beat. The customers around her stared, their eyes wide. A few gasped. The room, already tense, now felt like a powder keg ready to explode. These were not ordinary customers. The way they moved, the way they held themselves, everything about them screamed military precision. They were here for a reason. And no one was sure what that reason was. The leader of the group, a man with a scar running down his left cheek, a permanent mark from something he had clearly survived, looked around the room, taking everything in. His gaze fell first on the dog, then the man holding the leash. Then, without missing a beat, his sharp eyes turned to the young woman behind the counter. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with authority. The woman swallowed hard. For a moment, she felt like she had been caught in the middle of something much larger than herself. These weren't just any Marines, there was something different about them. Something serious. She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She wasn't sure what to say. The situation was spinning out of her control. The man with the service dog, still standing by the counter, didn't move. He stood there like a statue, his body language unwavering. His eyes flicked toward the Marines, then back to the woman. There was no fear in his gaze, only quiet determination. The Marine leader stepped forward, his boots making a solid, authoritative sound as he crossed the room. He looked at the woman again, his expression unreadable. "You need to let them be," he said, his words like a quiet command. "Or this will escalate." The young woman felt her heart pound in her chest. The tension in the room was unbearable. The Marines didn't look like they were joking. There was something in the air now, something heavy, something dangerous. The room seemed to shrink around her. She wanted to speak, but no words came out. A few patrons in the back of the room started to whisper, their voices low and hesitant. Some seemed confused, others seemed to recognize the gravity of the situation. No one dared to make a move. The young woman, her face pale, glanced nervously at the door. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was as if they had just crossed some invisible line. The man with the dog hadn't said anything further, but it was clear that the situation was far from over. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't another Marine or customer. A man in a black suit entered, his face hard and cold. He didn't look around the room. His gaze was fixed directly on the man with the service dog. "You need to leave," the woman said again, though this time her voice wavered. She felt trapped. The man in the suit didn't even acknowledge her. He moved past her, walking straight toward the counter. His eyes met the man's, those same cold, piercing eyes that had scanned the room moments before. The man in the suit's lips curled into a tight smile, and he stopped right beside the counter. The Marines stood still, silent now, but their eyes were locked on the newcomer. "You've made your point," the man in black said, his voice low but laced with something menacing. "Now, it's time to move." The dog whimpered softly, its tail between its legs as it looked up at the man. The young woman's breath hitched. She had no idea what was going on. But one thing was clear, this was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. And as the man with the service dog turned and started walking toward the exit, the tension in the room didn't fade. It lingered, thick and oppressive, as if the very air itself held its breath, waiting for the next move. What came next would change everything. The door slammed shut behind them, but the unsettling silence lingered in the air like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. The young woman behind the counter felt her legs tremble as she stood frozen, her mind racing. Her hand was still hovering near the phone, the very one she had almost used to call security, but it now felt like a useless object in her hand. She glanced toward the back of the restaurant, where a few of the patrons had already started to murmur to each other. Their hushed voices were like whispers of a dark secret, the kind that spread too quickly and always left a trail of confusion and fear in their wake. Her heart was still pounding from the earlier encounter, the face of the man with the service dog, and the commanding presence of the Marines. But it wasn't just the encounter itself that had shaken her, it was the feeling that something bigger was happening, something beyond her understanding. She had been around people with military backgrounds before, but this felt different. There was an edge to the situation, something dangerous, almost foreboding. The door had barely closed when the man in the black suit, the one who had followed the group of Marines, stopped at the small streetlight outside. He was looking at something on his phone, his brow furrowed, though his posture remained composed. He looked out of place in the quiet suburban town, as if he was a character dropped into a scene that didn't belong to him. The man with the service dog was walking a few paces ahead, his face unreadable, his movements deliberate. The dog trotted beside him, its steps cautious but confident, like it trusted the man more than it trusted the outside world. The Marines followed them at a safe distance, keeping their eyes sharp, their focus unwavering. As they walked toward the alley next to the restaurant, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the street. The man in black followed them, his pace quickening, his gaze never straying from the group ahead. Inside the restaurant, the young woman finally broke free from her frozen stance. She looked around, taking in the confused faces of the remaining customers. Some of them seemed too bewildered to speak, while others were whispering fervently to each other, speculating on what had just happened. She reached for her phone again, this time dialing the number she had been hesitating to call. The sound of the ringing seemed deafening in the otherwise quiet room. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. "Tim, it's Jess. There's something strange going on. Marines just walked in with a guy. He had a service dog, and now they're outside. But that man, there's something off about him. The Marines were with him like, they were protecting him." Jess felt her stomach knot. The voice on the other end of the line hesitated for a second, then responded in a tone that was half concern, half suspicion. "Where are you now?" "I'm still at the counter," she replied quickly. "I don't know what's going on, but I don't feel right about this. I need you to check the security footage from the back. Maybe I'm just overthinking it, but I swear this is bigger than I can handle." There was a pause before Tim spoke again. "I'll be right there." Jess ended the call and slowly lowered the phone. Her mind was racing. Why did this feel like a scene in a movie? The kind of movie where someone walked in, and the world shifted in ways that couldn't be explained. Outside, the situation was escalating quickly. The man in black was speaking to the man with the service dog now, his voice low and purposeful. The dog, still calm beside the man, was growing more alert with each passing second. It was as if it sensed the intensity of the conversation happening right in front of it. "What's your play here?" the man in black asked, his voice laced with subtle menace. He wasn't asking out of curiosity, he was demanding an answer. The tension between the two men was palpable, and the Marines flanked them, standing like silent sentinels, their eyes scanning the street. The man with the service dog didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the ground, as though he was weighing his options, figuring out how much of the truth he was willing to reveal. "It's not as simple as it seems," he finally said, his voice low and gravelly. "This isn't a fight I'm going to walk away from." The man in black's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you have a choice?" For a brief moment, there was silence again. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of the dog's leash in the wind. Then, the man with the service dog straightened his posture, his eyes hardening. "I don't need a choice. I've been through enough to know that I don't need one." The Marines exchanged quick glances, but said nothing. They understood that the man with the dog wasn't someone who feared conflict. He wasn't afraid to stand his ground, and if anything, that made him all the more dangerous. The man in black studied the group carefully, his lips still stretched into that thin, unsettling smile. He seemed to weigh his options before giving a subtle nod. "Fine," he said, his voice colder now. "We'll play it your way for now. But know this, nothing happens in this town without us knowing. You're not as invisible as you think you are." Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the alley, his footsteps echoing off the pavement. The Marines followed, though their eyes were still on the man with the service dog. The street was quiet again, but the tension didn't fade. It lingered, like a heavy fog that refused to clear. Jess stood by the counter, her heart still racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something big. And she had no idea how she was going to handle it when it did. As the minutes ticked by, she tried to calm herself, but her mind kept going back to the man with the dog, to the way he had stood his ground in the face of authority. He wasn't afraid of anything, and that was the most dangerous kind of person. Just as she was about to call Tim again, she heard the sharp sound of boots on the pavement. She looked up to see the man in black walking back toward the restaurant, his face now set in a grim expression. The Marines were no longer with him. They had dispersed, leaving him alone. His eyes were narrowed, as though he had just come to a decision. Jess's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what was happening, but she had a feeling that whatever it was about to get worse. The man in black stopped just outside the door, his hand hovering near the handle. He didn't enter, though. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Jess through the window. "You need to make a choice," he said, his voice carrying through the glass. "You don't want to be on the wrong side of this." She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a threat, but it sure felt like one. And then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked down the street, disappearing into the gathering shadows of the evening. Jess watched him go, her pulse racing. She felt like she had just stepped into something much bigger than she could handle. But she wasn't the only one who had noticed. The customers who had been watching the entire exchange were now looking at her, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. It was clear they wanted answers, but Jess had none to give. The door behind her opened again, and Tim stepped inside. His face was drawn tight with concern, but when he saw her, he stopped cold. "What happened?" he asked quietly, as if afraid the very air in the room might be dangerous. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I think it's only just beginning." Tim glanced toward the door, where the man in black had disappeared. "Then we better be ready for whatever comes next." And with that, the restaurant fell back into an uneasy quiet, the kind that always precedes something life-changing. Something no one could have predicted. The night had fallen heavy and fast. The streets outside the restaurant were now shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the flickering street lamps that cast eerie shadows on the sidewalk. Jess stood near the counter, her hands shaking, her mind still racing with the strange encounter from earlier. Her gut told her that something huge was unfolding, but she couldn't understand the why or the how. It was like watching a storm form on the horizon. She could sense its power, but couldn't predict its path. Tim had returned to the back of the restaurant to check the security footage, but Jess wasn't sure what he would find. How could he help when everything felt like it was slipping further out of their control? The chime above the door rang again, and Jess's heart jumped. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The man in black had returned. She didn't know why, but she knew he wasn't here to ask for directions or to order food. There was a purpose behind his presence, and it made the air in the restaurant feel thick, suffocating even. He walked in with the same calm demeanor, his face now blank, devoid of any expression. He glanced over the room before his eyes settled on Jess. There was no smile this time, no pretense. His face was stone cold, unreadable. "You," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. "We need to talk." Jess could barely form a response. She didn't know what to say, what to do. Every part of her wanted to turn and run, to find some kind of escape from this inexplicable situation, but she stood rooted to the spot, like a deer caught in headlights. "I didn't ask for this," Jess managed to say, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't even know what's happening." The man took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. He didn't seem to care that she was frightened. In fact, it seemed like that fear only made him more determined. He wasn't here to explain himself. He wasn't here to be reasonable. "You will," he replied, his tone low and threatening. "Sooner than you think. But you need to listen to me. You don't want to be on the wrong side of this. Trust me." Jess shook her head. "I don't trust anyone who doesn't even explain what's going on." The man didn't blink. "That's your choice. But understand this, the moment you're involved in this, there's no going back." The weight of his words settled like a heavy stone on Jess's chest. She had no idea what he was talking about, but the intensity in his eyes told her that it didn't matter if she understood. She was already in too deep. "I'm not in this," she said, her voice more forceful now. "I don't even know why you're here." The man paused, as if weighing her words, before taking another step forward. The air seemed to grow colder, the restaurant suddenly too small, too suffocating. The man leaned in slightly, just enough to make Jess feel cornered, but not so much that it was physical. "You're already in it," he replied. "You just don't know it yet. You're not the one who's going to stop it. But you could be the one who makes a difference when it all comes crashing down." Jess's breath caught. His words felt like a threat, but she wasn't sure if it was a direct one or some cryptic warning that would only make sense later. And if she were to make the wrong move, if she were to somehow refuse to cooperate, would it really be that easy for her to be caught up in something so dark? "You're not getting it," he continued, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "You think you can walk away from this. But everything you've seen today, everything you've heard, it's part of something much bigger. A plan you can't even begin to understand." A chill ran down her spine as she stared at him. This wasn't about the service dog. This wasn't about the Marines or even the strange encounter in the alley. This was something else entirely. "I'm not a part of whatever this is," Jess said, more to herself than to him. She took a step back, trying to steady her nerves. The man in black seemed to notice her retreat, and a small, almost imperceptible smile crossed his lips. It wasn't reassuring. In fact, it only made her more uneasy. "You already are," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And there's no going back." Just then, Tim emerged from the back of the restaurant, looking concerned but also confused. He had the security footage in his hands. His eyes met Jess's, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't expected: fear. Fear that mirrored her own. Tim's eyes flicked to the man in black. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. The man turned slowly to face Tim, his expression unchanged. "I think you know. But what I'm really asking is this: are you ready to step into the unknown?" Jess's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't believe what was happening. What was it that the man wanted? And why had he targeted her? She wasn't anyone special. She wasn't important. She was just a young woman working at a small-town restaurant. How did she get caught in the middle of whatever this was? Tim opened his mouth to speak, but the man raised a hand, cutting him off. Not yet. But soon. A sudden crash outside shattered the tension in the air. Jess whipped her head toward the door, her heart leaping in her chest. The man in black didn't even flinch. Instead, he turned toward the door, as if he had been expecting it. Jess's stomach sank as she saw the flash of headlights through the windows. The crash had been followed by a series of loud footsteps and shouting. She could barely make out the voices, but the chaos outside was unmistakable. Her hand instinctively reached for the phone in her pocket, but the man in black was faster. He grabbed her wrist, his grip strong but not painful. "I told you," he said quietly, his voice chilling in its calmness. "There's no turning back now." The door burst open, and the sound of heavy boots filled the room. Jess's breath caught in her throat. She saw 3 men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets, their guns drawn. They moved with the precision of trained soldiers, sweeping into the room with practiced ease. Their eyes scanned the restaurant, landing on Jess, then on Tim, and finally on the man in black. One of the soldiers stepped forward, his voice deep and authoritative. "He's with us." The tension in the room reached a new peak. Jess's mind raced. The Marines, the soldiers, the man in black, it all seemed like a blur now, a puzzle whose pieces didn't fit. "Tell me what's going on," Jess demanded, her voice rising. "Why are you doing this?" The soldier shook his head. "You don't want to know," he said, his voice grim. "But we can't let you walk away from this. Not anymore." The room seemed to close in around her. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. Jess looked at Tim, his face pale with fear. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know who to trust. But one thing was clear, whatever was happening, it wasn't something she could ignore. It wasn't something she could walk away from. The man in black stepped back, allowing the soldiers to move forward. He met Jess's eyes one last time. "I warned you," he said quietly. "You were already part of this." And with that, the soldiers moved to her side, guiding her toward the door. Jess didn't have the strength to fight back. She didn't know what she would find outside. She didn't know what was waiting for her. But deep down, she knew she would never be the same. The cold night air hit Jess like a slap to the face as she was ushered outside. The heavy footsteps of the soldiers echoed around her, their movements calculated, precise. They didn't say a word, but their presence alone spoke volumes. Tim followed behind, looking like he was caught in some nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Jess barely registered the passing cars, the dim streetlights, or the whispering wind in the trees. Her mind was elsewhere. Every moment felt distorted, like she was watching herself from a distance, trapped in a twisted reality she couldn't escape from. She had tried to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. The man in black, the Marines, the sudden chaos, it felt like she had stepped into someone else's story. But now, she was part of it. Whether she wanted to be or not. The military vehicles outside the restaurant were no longer just ominous shapes in the night. They were real, they were here, and they were about to change everything. Jess was pushed toward one of the black SUVs, its doors wide open, waiting for her. She glanced at Tim, his face pale and terrified, and for a split second, she considered telling him to run, to get away before it was too late. But there was no point. This wasn't something they could escape from. "Get in," one of the soldiers commanded, his voice flat, emotionless. Jess hesitated, but only for a moment. She had no choice. She climbed into the back seat, her breath shallow, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The soldier followed her inside, sitting next to her without a word. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off into the night. The journey felt like hours. Jess's mind kept spinning with questions that had no answers. Why had this happened? What did they want from her? What was going on? And most pressing of all, who could she trust? The military vehicle turned down an unfamiliar road, taking her further and further from everything she knew. The streetlights became fewer, and the buildings more spaced out. Soon, they were surrounded by nothing but trees and fields, a landscape so quiet and still it felt otherworldly. She couldn't stop herself from asking, "Where are we going?" The soldier next to her didn't even glance at her. He stared straight ahead, as if she hadn't spoken. His silence was suffocating. Jess opened her mouth to ask again, but before she could, the vehicle slowed to a stop. They were at a small, hidden compound, far from the city, tucked away behind thick iron gates. The gates opened slowly as the vehicle approached, the sound of metal scraping against metal sending a chill down Jess's spine. The SUV rolled forward, and she saw several other vehicles parked inside. There were men in suits, armed guards standing at attention, and a sense of sterile order that made everything feel wrong. Everything about this place screamed secrecy. And Jess, standing there in the back seat of this military SUV, was the only thing that didn't belong. The vehicle came to a halt in front of a large building, its steel walls gleaming coldly under the dim light. The door opened, and the soldiers ushered her out. They were efficient, moving her without any explanation. There was no kindness in their gestures, just commands, as if they were part of some larger machine that operated without emotion. Jess was led into the building, her eyes darting around nervously. She didn't know where they were taking her, but something in her gut told her it wasn't going to be good. She was pushed into a sterile white room, a place that looked like it belonged to an interrogation. A metal chair sat in the center, and across from it, there was a table with a few scattered documents. The walls were bare, the air heavy with tension. Without a word, the soldiers left her there. Jess sat in the chair, her knees trembling, but she wasn't about to let them see her fear. She had been through too much. She had to stay strong, even if she didn't know what came next. Moments later, the door opened again, and in stepped the man in black. His presence was overwhelming. Jess's stomach dropped as she locked eyes with him. His expression was unreadable, like a mask that could shift at any moment. He looked at her for a long, unnerving second before walking to the table and sitting down across from her. "I told you," he said, his voice low and controlled, "that you were already in this. You just didn't understand yet." Jess felt the weight of his words settle deep in her chest. She had no idea what he was talking about, but she could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on her. Whatever this was, it was bigger than her. Bigger than anything she could have ever imagined. "What do you want from me?" Jess asked, her voice shaking slightly, but her resolve clear. She wasn't going to let him see how terrified she really was. The man in black leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "I want you to understand the truth. Everything you've seen up until now, the dog, the Marines, the chaos at the restaurant, it's all connected. And it's only the beginning." Jess shook her head, trying to make sense of it. "But why me? Why involve me in this?" He smiled, but it wasn't reassuring. "Because you're the key to all of it. The service dog wasn't just a distraction. It was a signal. A message. And you've been part of the message since the moment you walked into that restaurant." Jess's mind reeled. "You're not making any sense. What message?" The man in black sighed, his eyes softening, almost as if he felt sorry for her. "You'll understand soon enough. But first, you need to hear the full story. The real story. The one they don't want you to know." The room seemed to close in around her as the man in black began to speak. His words were carefully measured, almost rehearsed. He told her about a network, a secret group that had been operating in the shadows for years. They were everywhere. Government officials, businessmen, military leaders, people with power and influence. And they had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, shaping events to suit their purposes. Jess's mind struggled to keep up with the story. It felt too big, too impossible to believe. But the man in black's words were like a key unlocking something inside her. A part of her that had always known that the world was not as simple as it seemed. A part of her that had known there was always more beneath the surface. The service dog wasn't just a random animal. It was part of a mission, a signal meant for the right people at the right time. And Jess had unknowingly been pulled into the heart of it. She felt her world unraveling. The confusion, the fear, the disbelief, they all started to make sense in the worst way possible. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a carefully orchestrated plan. And Jess was at the center of it. Before she could respond, the door opened again, and a tall man in a suit entered. His sharp features and icy blue eyes reminded Jess of a predator. He walked toward the man in black, his steps deliberate. "It's time," the man in the suit said, his voice smooth, calculated. The man in black nodded. "She's ready." Jess's pulse quickened. "Ready for what?" she demanded. The man in black didn't answer. Instead, he stood and motioned for Jess to follow. She didn't know what they were preparing for, but she knew one thing: her life would never be the same again. As the door clicked shut behind her, she couldn't help but wonder, how much of her life had really been her own? How much had been a carefully constructed illusion? And how far would she have to go to survive the truth?